A small-town police officer thought he'd caught a petty thief. A widowed mother quietly slipping napkins into her worn tote bag at a diner. But when he asked why, her answer stopped him cold. What began as a simple question unraveled a story of loss, hidden debt, and the quiet ways a mother fights to protect her children's dignity. This isn't about stealing. It's about survival, pride, and a community that learns the truth too late to forget it. What would you do if the thing you took wasn't for yourself, but the only comfort your kids had left? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The rain had started just after sunset, steady enough to turn Main Street into a ribbon of reflected neon. Inside Millie's diner, the smell of coffee and frying onions hung in the air, clinging to the linoleum and chrome like it had for decades. Officer Daniel Ruiz sat in a corner booth with his back to the wall, finishing a late dinner after a double shift. The place was quiet, except for the clink of cutlery and the hum of the ceiling fan. Across the room, a woman sat alone at the counter. She was nursing a cup of tea, both hands wrapped around it, as though she needed the warmth more than the drink. Her coat was damp at the shoulders, hair pulled back into a loose bun that looked like it had been done in a hurry. He noticed her not because she stood out, but because she didn't. She was the kind of person most people's eyes slid over. Ordinary, self-contained, and easy to forget. When Millie, the owner, disappeared into the kitchen to check on an order, the woman reached for the napkin dispenser. She slid it closer, her movements unhurried, almost casual. But instead of taking one or two to blot her hands or face, she pulled out a small stack, folding them in half with precise care. One after another, she tucked them into a worn canvas tote resting on the stool beside her. It wasn't the first time Ruiz had seen someone pocket something from the diner. Usually it was sugar packets or a couple of creamers. Nothing worth writing up, just small acts of quiet theft people convinced themselves didn't matter. But this was different. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't glancing over her shoulder. She was focused, methodical, as though the napkins were something she had come here specifically to get. He set down his fork and watched. The stack grew inside the bag, 20, maybe 30 napkins. She slid the dispenser back into place, aligning it neatly with the salt and pepper shakers. Then she took another sip of her tea, eyes on the window where rain streaked down in silver. Lines. Ruiz weighed the moment. If he approached her now, it would be obvious he'd been watching. But something about the way she handled the napkins, not like contraband, but like something important, made him curious. When she reached for her tote and slid off the stool, he caught Millie's eye from across the room. Millie gave the smallest shrugged, the kind that said she'd seen it happen but wasn't going to make a fuss. He intercepted the woman just as she reached the door. His voice was calm, polite. "Evening, ma'am? Mind if I ask what you're doing with all those napkins?" She froze, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, he saw the calculation there. Not fear exactly, but the quick weighing of possible answers. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then glanced back at the counter as though she might return them. "It's nothing," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I just needed them." "Needed them for what?" he asked, keeping his tone even. There was a pause. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its headlights sweeping across the diners. "Front windows?" She didn't speak until the sound faded. "For home," she said at last. "It's just napkins. Most people would have left it there. Napkins weren't worth paperwork, and they both knew it. But Ruiz had been on the job long enough, too. Hear the difference between someone hiding a petty crime and someone hiding something else entirely." There was a weight in her voice that didn't match the simplicity of the words. He glanced down at the bag, then back to her face. She looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep, a tiredness that seemed to live in her bones. Her coat was frayed at the cuffs, and the shoes peeking out from beneath her jeans were scuffed nearly to the lining. "I'm not looking to get you in trouble," he said quietly. "I just want to understand." She gave the faintest shake of her head, almost to herself, and for a moment he thought she might walk away without another word. Then, with a small sigh, she said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," Ruiz replied. Her eyes lingered on his for a long moment, searching for something, maybe judgment, maybe the possibility of trust. But whatever she saw made her look away. She adjusted the strap of her bag, pushed open the diner door, and stepped out into the rain without answering. Ruiz stood there for a few seconds, listening to the bell over the door jingle shut. The napkins were still in her bag. He could have stopped her, should have maybe, but instead he watched her disappear down the wet sidewalk, her figure swallowed by the dim glow of the street lamps. Something told him this wasn't the end of it. The rain followed her out onto the sidewalk, pooling in the uneven slabs of concrete that lined Main Street. She walked quickly, her head bent, the canvas tote pressed close to her side as though it might slip away if she didn't hold it tight. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out of the diner just in time to see her passing under the awning. The wind pushed the rain sideways, spotting her coat with dark patches. "Ma'am," he called after her, his voice carrying easily in the damp night air. She slowed but didn't turn around, so he took a few steps closer. "Ma'am, wait." A second, she stopped at the corner of the awning, still not facing him. The hand that gripped the tote strap flexed once, like she was deciding whether to run. Ruiz kept his tone measured, the kind of voice you used when you didn't want the other person to feel boxed in. "I'm not looking to make a big deal out of this," he said, "but I saw you take a lot of napkins back there. Can you tell?" Miwaya's shoulders rose with a slow breath, and then she turned. The light from the diner spilled out across her face, catching the faint shimmer of rain on her skin. She wasn't young. Lines framed her eyes, the kind carved by years of squinting against the sun and smiling too little. But her eyes themselves were steady, deep brown, and watchful. "It's not what you think," she said. Ruiz almost smiled. He'd heard that line hundreds of times. It was what everyone said before, explaining exactly what he thought. "Then tell me what it is," he replied. Her gaze flicked past him to the diner window, where Millie was wiping down the counter, pretending not to look. A couple of late-night customers sat in the far booth, their conversation low and unconcerned. Out here, it felt quieter, the rain muting the sounds of passing cars. "They're just napkins," she said at last, her voice barely louder than the rain. "I know," he said. "But you didn't just take a couple. You took enough for—" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding like an accusation, "for more than you'd use at the counter." She looked down at her bag as if weighing its contents. For a moment, he thought she might open it and show him. Instead, she pulled the strap higher on her shoulder and shook her head. "You probably think it's stupid," she said. "I don't think anything yet," Ruiz replied. "That's why. I'm asking." There was another pause, and he could hear the rain drumming on the diner's metal awning. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the movement restless. Finally, she met his eyes again, and he saw something there that didn't fit with the idea of petty theft. Not guilt, not defiance, something heavier, like the beginnings of shame mixed with exhaustion. "It's for home," she said, the words coming out clipped, like she wanted to end the conversation quickly. "Home," he repeated, not letting the thread go. "What for? At home." Her lips pressed together, and for the first time, she looked away completely, turning toward the street where the rain blurred the taillights of a passing car. He waited, not filling the silence. In his experience, people often said the thing they were holding back if you gave them enough space, but she didn't. Not then. She shifted her bag again and glanced over her shoulder, scanning the street as though checking for someone. When her eyes came back to his, there was a faint tremor in her voice. "You wouldn't understand. Maybe," Ruiz said, "but I can't try unless you tell me." Something flickered in her expression. Not quite trust, but something. Close to wanting to believe him, she opened her mouth, then closed it again, swallowing whatever answer had risen to the surface. "I have to go," she murmured. She stepped around him before he could say more, her boots splashing through a shallow puddle as she moved toward the corner. He didn't follow this time. Instead, he stood under the awning, watching her walk into the rain until she disappeared beyond the reach of the street lamps. He could have let it go. It was just napkins, after all. But the hesitation before she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to measure whether she could trust him, those things stuck with him. They told him there was more to the story, something that wouldn't be explained by a quick, convenient excuse. Inside, Millie caught his eye when he came back in. She didn't ask what had been said, and he didn't offer it. But as he slid back into his booth, Ruiz found himself glancing at the door every few minutes, wondering why a woman would guard a stack of paper napkins as though they were something precious. Her name was Margaret Hale, She was 41 years old, though the years showed differently on her than they might have on someone else. In the right light, and with the right kind of smile, she might have looked younger. But most days, there was a settled weariness in her expression that made people guess older. She had lived in the same small town her whole life, long enough to know the faces of the people who served her coffee, filled her gas tank, or handed her mail through the slot at the post office. They knew her too, at least in passing though. She had become less visible in recent years. That was by design. Her apartment sat above a laundromat on the quieter end of Main Street. It was technically 2 bedrooms, though one had been divided with a thin plywood partition to give the children some semblance of privacy. The walls were painted the dull beige of rental units everywhere, but in the corners where the paint peeled, you could see the pale blue from decades earlier. In winter, the floor stayed cold, no matter how high she turned the thermostat. And in summer, the single rattling window unit barely kept the heat at bay. 3 years ago, she had been a different person in a different life. Her husband, Daniel, had still been alive then. They had owned a modest but steady hardware store on Oak Street, the kind of place where he knew the regulars by name and kept a jar of peppermints on the counter for kids who came in with their parents. Margaret had worked alongside him, managing the books and the ordering, keeping the back office in a kind of organized chaos only she understood. They hadn't been wealthy, but the bills were paid, the kids had what they needed, and the future seemed like something they could plan for. Ended one September afternoon when Daniel's pickup was hit on the state highway by a delivery truck that drifted over the center line. He didn't survive the trip to the hospital. The accident left Margaret with 2 children, Lily, 8 at the time, and Ethan, 5, and a long list of things that no one had prepared her to handle alone. The grief was one thing that came in unpredictable waves, sometimes gentle enough to let her keep moving, sometimes hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. But the practical aftermath was its own kind of drowning. She learned quickly that Daniel had been keeping more from her than just his worries. The store, which she thought was stable, had been running on thin margins for years. There were unpaid loans, overdue supplier accounts, and a lease on the building that would come due in 6 months. She tried to keep it going, working the counter during the day and the books late at night, but the customers dwindled. The debts didn't. 6 months. After the funeral, she locked the door of the hardware store for the last time. The auction cleared some of what they owed, but not enough. The rest became a shadow that followed her into every new job, every application for credit. Every time she checked the mailbox, the apartment above the laundromat was all she could afford. When they lost the house, she took whatever work she could find, part-time at the grocery store, cleaning offices after hours, a seasonal job at the post office during the holidays. The jobs changed, but the money never stretched far enough. She learned to make $1 do more than it should, to cook soup from the scraps of a roasted chicken, to hem Ethan's pants into shorts when he outgrew them, and to take in Lily's dresses to make them last another year. Margaret didn't think of herself as poor. That word felt like a label other people used when they wanted to measure someone's worth against what they owned. She thought of herself instead as managing. Managing meant doing without certain things so that the important things, rent, utilities, food, could be covered. Managing meant keeping the light bill current even if it meant the cupboards held more canned goods than fresh produce. Managing meant finding ways to soften the sharp edges of want so the children didn't feel them too often. Lily was 10 now, with her father's eyes and her mother's habit of quietly observing before speaking. Ethan was 7, restless and curious, a boy who asked questions about everything and kept a collection of bottle caps in an old shoebox under his bed. They shared the larger of the 2 bedrooms, their sides marked by mismatched quilts and a line of bookshelves Daniel had built years ago. In the evenings, after homework and dinner, Margaret would sit at the small kitchen table, sorting through envelopes. Some held bills that could wait, others couldn't. She kept a small notepad beside her, where she wrote down due dates and the amount she could pay toward each one. She had become an expert at stretching not just food and clothing, but the space between a payment and the next phone call from a collector. People in town knew her as quiet, polite, the kind who would thank you twice for something as simple as holding a door. Few knew how carefully she navigated each day to keep her children sheltered from the full truth of their situation, and fewer still would have guessed that the woman they sometimes saw slipping extra napkins into her bag at the Dinah was the same one who used to ring them up at the hardware store with a smile, years before everything changed. The bell over the door chimed every time someone stepped into Hale's Hardware, a sound that had been part of Margaret's days for more than a decade. The store sat on the corner of Oak Street and 5th, its front windows lined with neat displays. Daniel arranged himself, rakes in the fall, snow shovels in the winter, seed packets and watering cans in the spring. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, polished smooth by years of customers pacing the aisles, and the air always carried a faint mix of machine oil, fresh lumber, and the peppermint candies Daniel kept in a jar on the counter. They opened the store together in their late 20s, newly married and eager to build something they could call their own. Daniel had worked construction since high school and could talk for hours about the merits of one brand of drill over another. Margaret had a knack for numbers and order, turning stacks of invoices into tidy ledgers and making sure every supplier was paid on time. She handled the bookkeeping and front window displays. He handled the tools, the customers who wanted advice, and the endless list of repairs the building always seemed to need. Mornings began early. Daniel would unlock the front door, flipping the sign from closed to open while Margaret brewed coffee in the back and swept the sawdust from the floor. By the time the first regulars came in, often retirees with small projects or farmers needing replacement parts, the store felt alive. Some customers stayed to chat, leaning on the counter as Daniel sketched solutions on scrap paper. Others moved quickly, in and out with a bag of nails or a new set of garden shears. On Saturdays, the store filled with families. Kids tugged their parents toward the candy jar while Daniel knelt to answer their questions about the displays. Margaret loved those days most, when the hum of conversation and the jingle of the doorbell never stopped. She kept a small radio behind the counter, tuned to the local station that played a mix of country songs and community announcements. There was a rhythm to their life then, the kind that made time slip by without notice. After closing, they would lock the register, turn off the front lights, and linger in the back room, tallying receipts while the smell of coffee from the morning still clung to the air. Sometimes they ate dinner right there. Daniel perched on an overturned bucket with a sandwich, while Margaret sat on the stool by the desk. They would talk about what needed restocking, which accounts to call, and whose birthday was coming up in town. It wasn't a glamorous living, but it was theirs. The store paid the mortgage on their modest house, kept gas in the truck, and allowed them small luxuries, dinner out once a month, a weekend at the lake in summer. They knew most of their customers by name, and in turn, most people in town knew them when Lily was born. A gone to hospital sign hung in the front window for 2 days while Daniel stayed with Margaret at the county medical center. When Ethan came along 3 years later, the regulars brought casseroles and knitted blankets. Leaving them in a pile on the back counter, Margaret never imagined those days would end. Even when the economy dipped and sales slowed, she believed they would weather it. Daniel had a way of brushing off her concerns with a grin and a promise that things would pick up in spring. And most years, they did. Looking back, she realized there had been signs she missed. The extra envelopes that stayed unopened in Daniel's desk drawer, the way he sometimes lingered over the bills longer than usual, the new line of credit he mentioned only once in passing. But at the time, she trusted that if something was wrong, they would face it together. In those years, her life was measured in seasons of inventory and the steady flow of familiar faces through the door. She wore the same navy apron every day, its pockets full of receipts, a pen, and a small pad of paper for notes. Daniel teased her for writing down everything, but it was her way of keeping control, of ensuring nothing slipped through the cracks. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The store was more than a business. It was a place where they built their marriage, raised their children between sales, and became part of the town's fabric. In the evenings, after the last customer left and the lights in the window were switched off, they would walk out together, locking the door behind them with the quiet satisfaction of people who believed they had created something that would last. Margaret held on to that feeling for as long as she could. Even now, years later, she could still hear the sound of the bell over the door and see Daniel's easy smile as he handed a customer the right wrench for the job, as if nothing in the world could break the rhythm they had built together. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of day that started out ordinary enough to make what followed feel impossible. The air had cooled overnight, and the maple trees along Oak Street had just started to turn, their leaves catching the morning sun in shades of red and gold. Margaret had been at the store with Daniel that morning, going over an order for winter supplies. He'd been restless, drumming his fingers on the counter as she calculated costs, eager to make a run into the next town for a part a customer needed. It was nothing unusual, a quick trip, 40 minutes there and back. He kissed her on the temple, said he'd be home in time for dinner. And the bell over the door jingled as he left. By mid-afternoon, the sky had dulled to a flat gray. Margaret was behind the counter, checking invoices, when she noticed the time and wondered why he hadn't returned. She thought about calling, but a customer came in asking for paint samples, and she pushed the thought aside. It wasn't until the phone rang, the sharp, urgent ring of the landline in the back office, that the day began to fracture. The voice on the other end belonged to a state trooper. He spoke carefully, the way people do when they know they're delivering a blow that will knock the air out of someone. There had been an accident on the state highway. Daniel's truck had been hit head-on by a delivery vehicle that drifted. Across the center line, they'd taken him to the hospital, but he hadn't made it. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. They felt like a sentence in a language she'd never heard before. She asked the trooper to repeat himself, as if hearing it again might somehow change it. But the words stayed the same, heavy and final. She remembered thanking him without knowing why, then setting the phone back in its cradle, as though it were made of glass. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she stood in the middle of the back room, staring at the stacks of receipts and the coffee mug Daniel had left that morning, a ring of black liquid cooling inside. She thought about the customer still browsing paint samples at the front counter, about the fact that she would have to walk out there and pretend for a few minutes longer that the ground beneath her hadn't just given way. Blur of black coats, murmured condolences, and the scent of lily so strong it clung to her hair for days. People told her she was strong, that she was handling it well. But they didn't see the way she sat in the dark after the children were asleep, clutching the corner of Daniel's flannel shirt like it might anchor her to the life they'd shared. The emotional loss was crushing, but the practical aftermath was its own storm. Bills began arriving in stacks. Some she had expected, others she hadn't known existed. Hospital charges for the brief time Daniel had been alive after the crash, the outstanding balance on the truck, overdue supplier invoices for the store, and then the loans, more than she realized, some in her name, others co-signed. The margins at the hardware store had been thinner than she knew, and without Daniel there to run it, the business began to sink almost immediately. She tried to keep it going in those first months, opening the store each morning, greeting customers with a smile that felt increasingly forced. But regulars who came for Daniel's advice now left with polite nods, their purchases smaller, their visits less frequent, revenue slipped, and the debts didn't wait. Creditors began calling their polite reminders hardening into demands. The spring after Daniel's death, the decision was no longer hers to make. She locked the door to the store one last time, the bell over it jingling softly in the empty air. The keys felt heavier than they should have when she handed them over to the auctioneer. The shelves were stripped bare in a week, the building emptied of the life they had built together. At home, the absence was everywhere in the quiet thud of only one pair of boots by the door. In the empty side of the bed, in the moments when the children asked questions she couldn't answer, without her voice breaking. The loss wasn't just of a husband and a father, but of the plans they'd made, the security they'd assumed, the rhythm of a life that had felt solid. She learned quickly that grief and survival don't take turns. They come at you all at once, forcing you to carry both without dropping either. And from that day forward, every choice she made, every bill she paid, every meal she scraped together, every long shift she worked was shaped by the moment the phone rang and the voice on the other end told her Daniel wasn't coming home. The first envelope came the week after the funeral, arriving in the same stack of sympathy cards and utility bills. Margaret almost set it aside, assuming it was another condolence note from someone who had been slow to hear the news. The return address was the hospital, printed in a sterile font that didn't match the warmth of the handwriting she'd been seeing for days. She opened it at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed. Still in the clothes she'd worn all day, her hair pulled back loosely as if she'd forgotten about it hours ago. The numbers inside didn't seem real at first. A single page stating a total balance that looked more like a phone number. There was no softness in the language, no acknowledgement of loss, just a due date and a list of itemized charges for the short. Margaret sat staring at it until the numbers blurred, and when she finally moved, she folded the bill in half, then in half again. Thing 1 bill. Something she could set up payments for, something that could be chipped away over time. Some bore the hospital's return address. Others came from labs, ambulance services, physicians whose names she barely remembered. Each one was its own demand, and none of them spoke to each other. There was no single place to call to make it right. The business mail had been coming to the store, and for a while she let it pile up on Daniel's desk, untouched. She wasn't ready to see the details of what was waiting for her there, but the calls started before long. Suppliers who had given them credit out of goodwill were suddenly asking for payment. The tone was polite at first, laced with condolences, but the politeness wore thinner with each passing week. When she finally forced herself to sort through the envelopes in the store's back office, she found more than she expected: invoices long past due, letters warning of accounts being sent to collections and buried in the bottom drawer, contracts for loans she hadn't known existed. Daniel's signature was there, neat and confident, alongside her own on some of them. Some were lines of credit for inventory, which she understood. Others were personal guarantees for equipment she hadn't even realized the store had purchased. It was disbelief. Daniel had never been reckless, not in the ways she thought of as dangerous. But he had always been stubborn about the store, unwilling to admit when things weren't going as well as they should. She could see now how easily he might have convinced himself that each loan was temporary, just a bridge to get through a slow season, that the next month or the next sale would make everything right again. The weight of it settled on her in pieces. The business debts were murkier, tied up in legal language, and signatures that might bind her in ways she couldn't yet understand. What was clear was that the life she thought they had built together had been standing on a thinner foundation than she realized. She began keeping the bills in a shoebox under the bed. Was no one to hide them from, but because she couldn't bear to see them out in the open. At night, after Lily and Ethan were asleep, she would take the box out, spread the envelopes across the kitchen table, and make lists in a notebook. The lists changed every week: which debts to pay first, which to ignore for now, which might be negotiated down if she could find the right person to talk to. It became a kind of silent ritual, called to ask how she was managing. No one wanted to talk about the numbers that didn't add up. People would bring her casseroles or offer to watch the children for an afternoon, but they couldn't know, the weight she was carrying in that shoebox. It wasn't the kind of grief you could cry over in public. It was the kind that pressed down on you in the most ordinary moments, standing in line at the grocery store. That no matter how hard you worked, you were already behind by the time the last of the funeral flowers had withered. Margaret understood that this was the part no one had prepared her for. The debts didn't pause out of respect for loss. They arrived without ceremony, slipped through the mail slot, or announced themselves with a ring of the phone, indifferent to the fact that the person who had made the promises was gone, and now they were hers, whether she had agreed to them or not. The days began to blur together in a way Margaret had never experienced before. Morning no longer felt like a fresh start. She awoke before the sun, the room still cloaked in the soft gray of early dawn, and moved quietly so as not to wake Lily and Ethan. The air in the apartment was cool. There was no time to linger. Her first shift started at 6, and if she wanted the children dressed and fed before she left, every minute mattered. The grocery store job was the earliest of the three. She stocked shelves in the quiet hours before customers arrived, working alongside a few other employees who rarely spoke more than necessary. The work was physical, the cardboard boxes sometimes heavy enough to strain her arms, but she found the predictability of it almost comforting. Cans went on the shelf in neat rows, labels facing out, and for a little while there was order. The pay was minimum wage, and the hours varied from week to week, but it was something she could count on to keep the lights on by midday. She would clock out, grab a sandwich often made at home and wrapped in wax paper to save every cent, and head to her second job at a small office downtown. She cleaned there in the afternoons, moving from desk to desk after the employees left for lunch meetings, emptying bins, dusting surfaces, vacuuming the carpet that never seemed dirty enough to warrant the effort. The office had floor-to-ceiling, windows that caught the afternoon light, and sometimes she would pause just for a moment. They always seemed to be moving with purpose, their clothes crisp, their hands free of the roughness hers had developed. Her last job was the hardest, not because of the work itself, but because it came when she was already tired. For evenings, a week, she helped close the diner on Maple Street, wiping down tables, refilling condiment bottles, stacking chairs onto tables so the floor could be mopped. By then, her legs ached and her hands smelled faintly of dish soap, no matter how often she washed them. Always slipped her a little extra in cash, pretending it was for odds and ends. Margaret accepted it without argument, though she suspected Millie knew more about her situation than she let on. Even with all 3 jobs, the math never changed much. The rent claimed the largest share, and the utilities followed close behind. Winter brought heating bills that made her chest tighten when she opened them, while summer meant running the old window unit just enough to keep the heat from becoming unbearable. Groceries were bought with precision, lists built around sales and coupons. Lily began to notice when there were fewer fresh vegetables on the table. Ethan asked why they couldn't go to the movie theater anymore. Instead, every saved dollar went into a small envelope in her dresser drawer labeled simply emergency. It never grew enough to feel like real security. There were days when exhaustion clung to her so tightly she moved through her shifts in a fog, doing what needed to be done without thinking too hard about the hours ahead. Nights were worse when she lay awake, calculating bills in her head, wondering which could be pushed back and which would bring a shutoff notice if left unpaid. She kept those thoughts to herself, not wanting the children to carry her worry on top of their own small fears. Her world, once wide enough to hold plans and dreams, had narrowed to the basics, keeping a roof over their heads, keeping the power on, keeping the cupboards from going empty. She passed storefronts in town advertising sales she no longer allowed herself to browse. Friends she had once met for coffee grew distant. Invitations stopped coming after she turned them down. Enough times, there was no room in her schedule for social calls and no spare money to justify them. Each week ended the same way it began, with her tallying the rent, the utilities, and the bare essentials against what she had earned. There was never anything left for extras. But she kept going, because the alternative, losing even the small, frayed stability she had built, was unthinkable. And so, she moved from one job to the next. Her life contracted to the narrow strip of time between work and home. Her children still had a place to sleep, and the lights still came on when she flipped the switch. It started with a note folded into Lily's backpack. The paper was printed with the school's logo at the top and the words "Low Balance Notice" in bold letters just below. Margaret read it standing at the kitchen counter, the steam from the pot of boiling pasta fogging the edges of her glasses. It wasn't the first time she'd seen one. The school cafeteria kept a running tab for students, and when the account dropped too low, they sent reminders home. Usually, she could cover it within a day or 2. This time, the balance wasn't just low, it was already negative. She set the note aside, stirring the pasta while she thought about the numbers she had in her head. The rent was due in less than a week. The electric bill was sitting on the table, waiting to be paid before the shutoff date printed in red at the top. She could send a check to the school, but it would mean something else would have to wait, and lately there wasn't much left that could dot the following morning. Instead of sending Lily and Ethan to school with lunch money, she packed them each a brown paper bag, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, a small bag of pretzels, an apple, and a folded paper napkin. She tucked the bags into their backpacks with a smile, telling them she thought it would be fun to bring lunch from home for a while. Lily, old enough to sense there was more to the decision, only nodded. Ethan didn't question it at all. He liked the idea of trading snacks with friends. For the first few days, it felt manageable. She made sandwiches in the evenings while dinner cooked, lining them up on the counter and wrapping them in wax paper. But keeping up with it meant stretching her grocery list in new ways. Buying fresh fruit every week became a luxury, so sometimes it was canned peaches or applesauce cups instead. The little bags of chips or crackers she used to toss into the cart without thinking were now calculated purchases reserved for the days she knew the kids might have a harder time eating just a sandwich and fruit. A week later, another note came, this one worded more firmly, stating that until the balance was paid in full, the children would not be permitted to purchase lunch. Margaret folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer with the unopened bills. It wasn't that she didn't want to pay, it was that she couldn't right now, not without falling short somewhere else. She became meticulous about the lunches. Each morning she checked the pantry, figuring out what could be swapped or stretched. Sometimes she used leftover chicken from dinner to make wraps. Other days it was just bread with butter and cinnamon sugar, the way she'd eaten as a child. When the cupboards were thin, she made sure the napkins were folded neatly, even if they were the rough paper kind she'd taken from the diner or brought home from one of her shifts. The children didn't complain. Lily, protective of her younger brother, even told her once that the lunches were better than cafeteria food. But Margaret noticed the way Lily started eating more slowly, drawing out the time so her friends would finish before seeing the contents of her bag. Ethan was less guarded, but once he came home with his sandwich untouched, saying a boy at his table had wrinkled his nose and called it poor food. It wasn't just about hunger. Margaret knew the cafeteria was one of the few places in the day where kids could feel equal, everyone lining up for the same trays, the same plastic cups of milk, the same handful of carrot sticks. When her children carried their own bags, they were marked as different. And in the quiet spaces between her work shifts, that knowledge sat heavily on her. Still, the math didn't change. She told herself it was temporary, that she would pay down the balance as soon as she could, and then they could go back to buying lunch like everyone else. But weeks passed, and the envelope marked school meals in her dresser remained empty. So she kept packing the lunches, folding the napkins, and hoping her children understood that this wasn't about denying them something. It was about making sure there was enough for them to come home to each night, lights that turned on, heat in the winter, and a locked door between them and the street outside. It began almost without her realizing it. One evening, after a late shift at the diner, she noticed a stack of paper napkins left behind on a recently cleared table. They were folded neatly, untouched, the kind the restaurant kept in metal holders. At every booth, something in her paused. They weren't much thin, slightly rough to the touch, but they were clean, and they were free. She slipped them into her apron pocket before heading to the next table. The first time she used them at home, it was for Ethan's lunch. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the sandwich from sliding around, and it gave him something to wipe his hands with afterward. That night, he told her it had worked well, and she felt a small, quiet relief. Not the pride of solving a big problem, but the satisfaction of making something just a little better. From then on, she began noticing napkins everywhere. In the corner of a counter at the coffee shop, where she sometimes stopped for a discounted muffin before her cleaning shift, stacked in dispensers at the grocery store cafe, left untouched at the tables she cleared at the diner. She never took more than a few at a time, never enough for anyone to notice something missing. It wasn't stealing, not in the way she understood the word. It was using what would otherwise be thrown away or forgotten. The napkins became part of her quiet system. She kept a small bundle in her tote bag, wrapped with a rubber band, and another in a kitchen drawer at home. In the mornings, when she packed lunches, she would fold one carefully around a sandwich or slip a couple into the corner of a brown bag as makeshift tissues. Lily sometimes used hers to wrap half an apple she wanted to save for later. Ethan liked to crumple his up after lunch and toss it into the bin like a basketball shot, grinning when he made it. Margaret told no one. To explain it would be to expose something she didn't want seen, not the napkins themselves, but what they represented, that she couldn't afford to buy boxes of tissues regularly, that even the smallest household staples had become choices instead of givens. There were moments she felt a twinge of embarrassment, standing, in a cafe with her hand hovering near the napkin dispenser, waiting for a stranger to look away before taking two instead of one. They were a way to make her children's lunches feel a little more put together. Even if the bread was from the discount rack and the fruit was bruised, on days when work ran late and she had no energy for a trip to the store, the napkin stash in the drawer felt like a small safety net. She could still send the children to school with something clean in their bags, still maintain the appearance of order. It wasn't about pretending to have more than they did. It was about giving her children as much normalcy as she could manage. Sometimes, after the dinner rush at the diner, she would linger in the empty booths for a moment, her hands resting on the cool surface of the table, before sliding the unused napkins into her tote. The sound they made, the faint rustle of paper against fabric, became familiar. It was such a small act, invisible to almost everyone, yet it carried a weight she felt every time. Not the grand, kind people talked about, but the fragile, everyday version that came from making sure her children had what they needed in ways that didn't make them feel different from the others. And if that meant slipping a few napkins into her bag when no one was watching, it was a trade she was willing to make. Daniel Ruiz had seen plenty of small, forgettable encounters in his years on the force. Most of them blurred together, routine traffic stops, the occasional shoplifting report, the quiet patrols through streets he could navigate in his sleep. But that night outside the diner stayed with him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the napkins themselves. He'd watched people pocket worse without thinking twice. It was her, the way she froze when he asked the question. The measured way her eyes seemed to weigh every possible answer before settling on the safest one. Back at the station, he tried to focus on the paperwork waiting on his desk. He typed incident notes, checked reports, made a call about a noise complaint, but his mind kept circling back to the woman in the worn coat with the canvas tote. She hadn't looked like someone trying to get away with something. There was no twitch of guilt, no defensive bluster. There had been something guarded there instead, like she was bracing for judgment, not punishment. He could still see her standing under the diner's awning, rain dripping from her hair, her hand clenched tight around that bag. There had been a flicker in her expression when he pressed her, something he recognized but couldn't immediately name. It reminded him of people he'd spoken to after storms, the ones who stood in front of damaged homes and said they were fine. When it was obvious, they weren't. A stubborn mix of pride and weariness. He told himself it wasn't his business. She hadn't committed a crime worth pursuing, and even if she had, he doubted the chief would thank him for chasing down the mystery of a stack of paper napkins. But as he sat in his cruiser later that night, idling on the edge of Main Street, he found himself looking toward the sidewalks. Scanning for her, it wasn't about catching her again. He wanted to understand. He'd grown up in this town, knew most of the families by sight if not by name, and he was fairly certain he had never seen her before. Or maybe he had, back when life had been different for her, and she'd been just another face at the hardware store or in the school parking lot. Small towns had a way of erasing people when their circumstances changed. He thought about the way she'd said, "You wouldn't understand." There hadn't been bitterness in it, just certainty, as if she'd already decided there was no point in trying to explain her life to someone wearing a uniform. That stung a little. He liked to think of himself as someone who listened, who could be trusted to hear the truth without turning it into a weapon. Driving past the diner the next afternoon, he slowed just enough to glance through the windows. She wasn't there, only Millie behind the counter, refilling coffee cups for the regulars. He considered stopping in to ask about her, but the thought felt intrusive, like stepping into something she hadn't invited him to know. Still, the image of her lingered, not just her face, but the way she'd carried herself, shoulders slightly hunched, not from fear, but from the invisible weight of something she'd been holding for a long time. He'd seen that posture before in people who lived close to the edge, always calculating, always deciding what they could go without. That night, he lay in bed and found himself replaying the conversation, brief as it was. He thought of the pause before she answered him, the space where he imagined she was deciding whether to trust him or not. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had kept her from telling the truth wasn't about the napkins at all. It was about something larger, something that had been shaping her life long before he'd noticed her at the counter. The next time he saw her, he promised himself he wouldn't let the moment pass so easily. Not to accuse, not to pry, but to understand, because there was a story behind that hesitation, and he had the uneasy sense that it wasn't one many people had bothered to hear. The building was one Daniel had driven past countless times without paying it much attention. A narrow 3-story structure wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat. Its bricks darkened by years of weather and exhaust from the traffic on Main Street. The front steps sagged slightly in the middle, and the railings bore a film of rust that left faint orange streaks on the palms if you held them too tightly. The kind of place people lived when they had few other options. He told himself it was just a welfare check. The department encouraged them now and then, especially when it came to residents who might be struggling or living in vulnerable situations. That made it official enough to ease whatever part of him questioned why he was here at all. Still, as he climbed the steps, there was a small knot in his chest that had nothing to do with procedure. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of laundry, detergent, and something older, a mix of dust and cooking oil that had soaked into the walls over the years. The carpet was worn thin in the center, showing the darker weave beneath, and a single bulb overhead buzzed faintly. Apartment to be was halfway down on the right, the number on the door slightly askew. He knocked twice. For a moment, he thought, no one was home. Then the chain rattled, and the door opened a few inches. She stood there, her hair pulled back, wearing a faded sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed to her elbows. The same canvas tote he'd seen at the diner hung from a hook on the wall behind her. "Officer," she said, her voice neutral. Not surprised, but not welcoming either. "Hi, ma'am. Sorry to bother you," Daniel replied. "I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd check in. Just making sure everything's okay." She hesitated, then unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. "Everything's fine." It sounded automatic, but she stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small, the living room barely big enough for a couch and a low coffee table that had seen better days. A few children's drawings were taped to the wall, their corners curling, the paper slightly wrinkled. In one corner, a space heater hummed quietly, its orange coils glowing. He noticed the kitchen from where he stood, narrow with mismatched plates stacked in the drying rack, and a single cupboard door that didn't quite close. "Nice place," he said, because it felt like the kind of thing you were supposed to say when you were in someone's home, though the truth was less about niceness and more about how clean it was, despite how little there was. She gave a short smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's what I can manage." He didn't push. Instead, he glanced toward the hallway where two bedroom doors stood open. From one came the faint sound of a child's voice reading aloud. She noticed his gaze. "My daughter's in there, doing homework with her brother. They'll be out in a bit." Daniel nodded. "You work nights." "Sometimes," she said. "I try to be here for them in the mornings, though." They stood there for a moment in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. He noticed a small stack of folded napkins on the counter, the cheap, thin kind you saw in diners and fast food places. They were wrapped in a rubber band, sitting neatly beside a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. He didn't comment, but it added weight to the picture that had been forming in his mind since their first meeting. "I'm not here about anything official," he said finally. "I just wanted to make sure you're doing okay." She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. "We're fine," she said again, though softer this time. Then, almost as if she regretted letting even that much show, she added, "I appreciate you checking." He left a few minutes later, walking back down the dim hallway with the image of that counter fixed in his mind, the jar of peanut butter, the bread, and the stack of napkins. It told him more than she had said out loud, and it made him think that whatever her story was, it was one worth hearing in full. The moment he stepped a little farther into the apartment, Daniel saw details he'd missed at first glance. The cupboards above the small kitchen counter were open just enough for him to catch sight of their contents, or rather, the lack of them. A half-empty box of cereal sat beside a single can of soup. And there was a jar of instant coffee with its label peeling at the edges. No clutter, no extras, just the kind of bare essentials that made a kitchen look more like a storage shelf than a place where meals came together easily. The fridge was humming quietly in the corner, but when she opened it to take out a carton of milk for the children, he noticed it was only about a third full. A few plastic containers stacked neatly on one side, a carton of eggs, and a jug of water took up most of the space. Everything was arranged with care, as if neatness could make up for the absence of variety. The living room told its own quiet story. The couch had a faded floral pattern, the fabric thinning in spots, the cushions slightly sagging. A coffee table sat in front of it, its surface marked by faint rings where mugs had once rested. The chairs didn't match. One was a dining chair with a cushion tied to it, the other a soft armchair that had clearly been rescued from somewhere else, its seams fraying along one arm. Nothing in the room seemed new, but everything was clean, as though she worked hard to keep things in order, despite the years on each piece. On the counter, beside the loaf of bread and peanut butter, Daniel's eyes landed again on the stack of napkins. They were folded precisely, bound by a single rubber band, and he realized there were smaller stacks tucked in other corners, one near the sink, another on the coffee table beside a remote held together with a strip of tape. He began noticing Them everywhere, little squares of white that seemed to serve 100 purposes. She reached for one to wipe a smudge from the table, then used another to wrap the last half of a sandwich before tucking it into the fridge. On the arm of the couch, one rested beneath a chipped mug to keep it from leaving marks. In the hallway, near the children's room, a crumpled napkin sat on top of a shoebox, covering what looked like a small snack left for later. It struck him that these napkins weren't just for wiping hands. They had become stand-ins for paper towels, sandwich wraps, coasters, and cleaning cloths. Cheap, disposable, endlessly repurposed. He'd never thought much about how many small, everyday items most people took for granted: paper towels, food storage containers, kitchen rags, until he saw them replaced by this thin white paper. Margaret seemed aware of his gaze, though she didn't explain. Instead, she moved with quiet efficiency, her hands practiced in making do. She tore a napkin in half to place beneath a glass, folded another to line a small plastic container, wiped the counter with one that had already been used once but was still good enough for one more pass. There was no waste here, but there was no abundance either. The walls, too, spoke of restraint. A few family photographs were arranged on a narrow shelf. Most of them older, the kind taken before her life, had been pared down to this. In the corner, a laundry basket sat half full, the clothes inside neatly folded but worn thin from years of washing. Daniel felt a heaviness settle in his chest as he stood there, taking it all in. This was not the kind of poverty that screamed for attention. It was the quiet kind, the kind that lived behind closed doors and polite smiles. It didn't look dramatic at first glance, but once you started to see it, you couldn't unsee it. Every detail told the same story: a home kept afloat by resourcefulness, a life without room for spare anything. When he left that afternoon, the image that stayed with him wasn't the emptiness of the cupboards or the mismatched furniture. It was the small, ordered stack of napkins on the counter, waiting to be turned into whatever the day required. That, more than anything, told him just how far she had learned to stretch what little she had. In buildings like this, walls were thin enough to carry voices, but thick enough to make them easy to pretend you hadn't heard. Daniel didn't live here, but as he walked down the hallway after leaving Margaret's apartment, he caught fragments of conversation from behind doors, left slightly ajar. It wasn't anything direct, just low murmurs, the kind people used when they thought they were being discreet, but still wanted to be overheard by someone near the stairwell. Two women stood with grocery bags at their feet, talking in that measured way that suggested they had been discussing the same topic for some time. He slowed his steps without meaning to, the words drifting toward him. "She's too proud, that's the trouble," one said. "Would rather scrape by than let anyone lend a hand?" The other made a soft noise of agreement. "Always saying she's fine. But I see her at the bus stop with those kids in the rain. No umbrella, no nothing." They weren't speaking with malice. If anything, there was a kind of resigned sympathy in their tone, the way people talk when they've stopped expecting a situation to change. Still, the words carried weight. Pride was one of those double-edged things. It could keep you standing when life knocked you flat, but it could also keep you from reaching out when you truly needed a hand. Daniel passed them with a polite nod, and they fell silent until he reached the landing. He could feel their eyes on him as he went down the stairs. Outside, near the mailboxes, an older man in a worn ball cap was sorting through envelopes. He glanced up as Daniel approached. "Checking on Margaret?" he asked, not bothering to hide the familiarity. When Daniel said yes, the man gave a short nod. "She won't tell you if she's in trouble, won't tell anyone, just keeps her head down and carries on." It was becoming clear that her reputation in the building wasn't built on drama or troublemaking, but on a kind of quiet distance. She wasn't unfriendly, just careful. She kept conversations short, accepted small talk without inviting follow-up questions. She paid her rent on time, kept her place tidy, and never asked for favors. It was the kind of behavior that, over time, made people stop offering more than the barest pleasantries. Later, Daniel would think about how isolation didn't always come from being pushed away by others. Sometimes it came from the person themselves, building small, invisible barriers because the alternative, admitting need, felt too risky. Pride and self-preservation could look almost identical from the outside as he stood near his cruiser. He noticed a young mother from the third floor shepherding her toddler inside. She paused when she saw him. "She's a good neighbor," the woman said. "Keeps to herself, but never any trouble." There was a pause before she added, "I offered her some extra groceries once. She wouldn't take them, said she had enough. But I'd just seen her come back from the food bank 2 blocks over." The comment lingered in his mind as he drove away. This wasn't about someone refusing help out of stubbornness alone. It seemed more complicated, layered with a kind of dignity that didn't want to be chipped away by pity. To the neighbors, that dignity translated into pride. And in a place where lives were lived in close proximity, but rarely intertwined, pride was both respected and quietly criticized. The whispers, he realized, weren't about gossip. They were acknowledgments that everyone could see she was struggling, that she could use help, and that she wasn't going to accept it on anyone's terms but her own. That made her a puzzle to the people around her, a story they could only tell in fragments when she wasn't in earshot. Daniel thought back to the way she had looked at him when he'd first asked about the napkins. The same hesitation, the same guarded calculation. It was all part of the same unspoken rule she seemed to live by. Accept what you can manage yourself, and nothing more. Whatever the cost, keep the rest to yourself. The first time Daniel met the children, they were sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a board game spread between them. Lily, the older one, had her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, a pencil tucked behind her ear as if she'd been doing homework before deciding the game was more interesting. Ethan sat across from her, his socks mismatched, concentrating hard on his next move. They both looked up when Daniel stepped inside, their expressions curious but not wary. Margaret introduced them quickly, her tone casual, as though having a police officer in their apartment was nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel crouched down to their level and asked what game they were playing. Ethan mumbled the title, and Lily volunteered that she was winning something her brother immediately disputed. With a grin, it was a small, easy moment, but what struck Daniel most was how comfortable they seemed in their space, even though it was modest. Their world was clearly built around the little they had, yet it functioned because their mother had made it work. He noticed the sandwiches sitting on the coffee table, each wrapped neatly in a folded napkin. The bread was held together firmly, no crumbs spilling out, the napkin corners tucked in as though she'd done it 1,000 times. Lily caught him looking. "These are the good ones," she said, holding up her sandwich for emphasis. "They don't rip when you fold them." Ethan nodded in agreement, chewing. "Sometimes we get the thin ones, and then everything falls out," he added, his tone matter of fact. Daniel glanced toward Margaret, who was in the kitchen rinsing a cup. She didn't seem to be listening, but her shoulders stiffened just slightly, the only sign she'd heard. He turned back to the children. "The good ones?" he asked, curious. "Yeah," Lily said, taking a bite before continuing. "When Mom finds the ones from the diner down the street, they're stronger. They don't get soggy if you have peanut butter and jelly. The other kind just kind of melt." She wrinkled her nose. Ethan chimed in again, more animated now. "Once, she brought home these really big ones from the pizza place. We used them for 2 days. We put snacks in them, and we could fold them around cookies without them breaking." He grinned like it was a memory worth keeping. There was no embarrassment in their voices, no sense that this was anything unusual. Finding the good napkins was a small victory, a treat in a life where small things mattered. The way they spoke about it, it might as well have been like other kids talking about their favorite brand of lunchbox or a special snack in the cupboard. Daniel nodded slowly, not sure how to respond without making them feel self-conscious. "Sounds like your mom's pretty good at finding the best stuff," he said finally. Both children nodded, the agreement immediate and wholehearted. Lily leaned over to adjust Ethan's sandwich wrap, tucking the edge more securely. "If you fold it like this," she explained to him, "it won't fall apart." The way she said it, Daniel could hear her mother's voice in it, the quiet practicality, the efficiency born from doing things out of necessity rather than choice. He sat with them for a few more minutes, listening to their chatter about school and the small routines that made up their days. Every so often, they would circle back to a detail about lunches, which snacks were good for trading, which napkins were best for wrapping cheese sticks, how sometimes their mom drew a little smiley face on the outside if she found a pen that still worked. It was clear that, in their eyes, their mother's scavenging wasn't something to pity. It was a skill, a quiet kind of resourcefulness that made their lives a little easier. even if they didn't fully understand why she had to do it in the first place. The good napkins were just one part of that, a small but tangible, the sign that she was paying attention, that she was always looking for ways to make what they had stretch further. When Daniel finally stood to leave, Ethan asked if he could take the rest of his sandwich to his room. Margaret said yes, and he wrapped it carefully in the same napkin, tucking the edges in just like his sister had shown him. It struck Daniel that this was more than just about keeping bread from falling apart. It was about preserving what little you had, making sure it lasted, and finding pride in doing it well, even if the rest of the world never noticed. Daniel sat in his cruiser long after leaving the apartment, the engine idling as the rain tapped lightly against the windshield. His radio crackled with small-town chatter, a minor fender bender on Oak Street, a call about a loose dog. But none of it held his attention. His mind kept circling back to Margaret, to the look in her eyes at the diner, to the sound of her children talking about the good napkins like they were something special. By policy, he was supposed to note anything resembling theft, no matter how small. Technically, slipping a stack of napkins into a tote bag wasn't a capital offense, but it was still taking property without permission. If he filed the report, it would go into a system that didn't know how to measure intent, only actions. There would be paperwork, maybe a fine, maybe worse if someone decided to make an example out of it. He could already picture her standing in the fluorescent-lit lobby of the courthouse, waiting for her name to be called, clutching her bag the way she had that night. He drummed his fingers lightly on the steering wheel. The other option was to do nothing. He could let it pass, file it away in his own memory instead of the department's records. But doing nothing felt like turning his back on something bigger. Not a crime, but a problem. He had seen households, like hers before, people who lived right on the edge, balancing bills against groceries, skipping one to cover the other. Most of the time, the people in those situations didn't want charity. They wanted stability, something harder to give. The dilemma wasn't just about whether or not to report her. It was about what kind of officer he wanted to be. The uniform gave him rules to follow, but it also put him in a position to see the gaps those rules didn't cover. In training, they called it discretion. On the street, it was something messier. Judgment calls that stayed with you. He leaned back in the seat, staring at the damp glow of the streetlights. If he brought it up to the chief, he could already hear the questions. Why was she taking them? Did she admit it? Was there a history? He would have to answer honestly, and the answers would point to a woman trying to make her kids' lives a little easier with what she could get her hands on. It wasn't exactly a case for prosecution, but it wasn't something the department liked to ignore either. Then there was the other path, finding a way to help without making it official. That could mean asking around, seeing if someone at the diner might be willing to look the other way, or even setting something aside for her himself. But there was risk in that, too. If she found out, she might see it as pity, and he suspected. She valued her pride more than most people valued comfort. He'd learned enough from the neighbors' whispers to know she didn't take handouts. He thought about the kids again, about Lily explaining how the good napkins kept sandwiches from falling apart. There had been no shame in her voice, just matter-of-fact appreciation. To them, it wasn't about stealing. It was about their mother finding something that worked. The rules didn't account for that either. The wipers squeaked across the glass, clearing away a streak of water. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the choice pressing on him. The simplest move would be to write the whole thing off, let it disappear into the 100 other small observations he made every week. But part of him knew that would mean walking away from a family that could quietly slip further into hardship without anyone noticing. He put the cruiser in gear, still undecided. For now, he would hold on to it, not as a report, but as a question that hadn't yet found its answer. Somewhere between the lines of the law and the edges of human need, he had to decide where he stood. The basement of St. Andrew's smelled faintly of brewed coffee and canned goods. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow over rows of folding tables stacked with neatly organized donations, boxes of pasta, bags of rice, dented cans of vegetables, and a small selection of day-old bread from the bakery on Main Street. A handwritten sign on the wall read, "Take what you need, God provides." Though everyone in line seemed to interpret that differently, it was close. 2:09 on a Tuesday night, the hour when the pantry stayed open for late shift workers who couldn't make the daytime hours. The line was short now, just a handful of people shuffling forward one by one, grocery bags in hand. Margaret stood near the back, her tote slung over her shoulder, its faded strap fraying at the edges. She kept her eyes on the floor, not out of shame exactly, but out of habit. The less attention she drew, the easier it was to move in and out without small talk. When it was her turn, a volunteer in a green sweater greeted her with a warm but tired smile. "Evening. Go ahead and take 6 items from the table, and bread's on the end there," she said, motioning toward the stacks. Margaret nodded, stepping forward. She glanced over the options slowly, her hands moving with deliberate care. She picked up a small bag of rice, setting it gently in her tote. Next, a can of tuna, a box of macaroni and cheese. She hesitated over a jar of peanut butter, looking at the label as though considering the ingredients, then placed it back. 2 cans of beans went into her bag instead, followed by a single box of tea bags. The volunteer, still counting items from behind the table, frowned slightly. "That's only 5. You can take 1 more if you need it," she reminded. Margaret shook her head lightly. "This is enough," she said, her voice soft but certain. The volunteer didn't press, only nodded. Margaret moved to the bread table, where 3 loaves remained. She picked the smallest one, tucking it under her arm. Around her, the other people in line took their full share, sometimes more if the volunteers weren't looking closely. She didn't notice, or pretended not to, as she stepped toward the exit. She passed Officer Ruiz, who had come by to drop off a box of donated pasta his sister had collected. He hadn't expected to see her there, and for a moment, he stayed still, watching her. She moved with quiet efficiency, her bag held close, as though she wanted to be outside before anyone could register her presence. When she reached the door, one of the other volunteers called after her. "Margaret, you sure you don't want to grab a jar of sauce or some cereal? We've got plenty tonight." She offered a small smile over her shoulder. "Leave it for someone else. I've got what I need." Then she slipped out into the cool night air, the door swinging shut behind her. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, the sound of distant traffic carrying faintly through the quiet streets. Margaret walked quickly toward the sidewalk, her steps steady. Ruiz followed a few moments later, not to stop her this time, but to understand. He watched as she turned the corner, her figure illuminated briefly under a street lamp before disappearing into the shadows. It wasn't that she didn't need more. That much was obvious from the bare cupboards he'd seen in her apartment. It was that she seemed unwilling to take what she thought might belong to someone else. Even here, in a place meant to help. She measured her portion like there was an invisible scale she refused to tip in her favor. Back inside, the volunteer in the green sweater started packing the leftover bread into a freezer bag. "She's always like that," she told Ruiz when she noticed him glancing at the door. "Never takes all she's allowed. Says she doesn't want to be greedy. I think she just doesn't want anyone thinking she's here for a handout." Ruiz nodded, the explanation fitting too well with what he already knew. Her pride wasn't loud or stubborn. It was woven into every choice she made, even when it cost her. He left the basement that night with the image of her walking away under the street lamp, her bag half full, and wondered again how much longer she could keep living like that before something or someone had to step in. The next time Ruiz found himself in Margaret's apartment, it wasn't planned. He had stopped by to follow up on a noise complaint from a neighbor, a misunderstanding that turned out to be nothing more than a loose vent cover rattling in the wind. She had invited him in while he checked the window frame in the kitchen, the only room with enough light to see without pulling out his flashlight. The kitchen was small, the kind built for one person to move in and out of quickly rather than for gathering. The table was pushed into the corner, 2 mismatched chairs tucked beneath it. A thin curtain hung over the window above the sink, patterned with faded blue flowers. On the counter, a jar of instant coffee sat beside a chipped mug, and beside that, a single plate holding a half loaf of bread, wrapped in the kind of plastic you get from the church pantry. While leaning down to check the vent by the baseboard, Ruiz noticed a drawer slightly open near the end of the counter. Inside, stacks of folded napkins, the kind he had seen her collecting, were arranged neatly beside a roll of tape, a small notepad, and a stub of a pencil worn down almost to the metal. Tucked just under the napkins, partially hidden from view, was a white envelope. The corner was bent, the county seal visible in blue ink. The return address read, County Department of Human Services. He stood for a moment, glancing toward the doorway where Margaret was speaking to Ethan in the living room. The boy's voice was soft, something about homework and a missing eraser. Ruiz looked back at the envelope. It was sealed, unmarked, except for her name and the date in the top corner, nearly 3 weeks old. When Margaret returned to the kitchen, wiping her hands on the hem of her sweater, she saw his eyes drift toward the drawer. For a split second, her expression shifted, not anger exactly, but a tightening, a flicker of something defensive. She slid the drawer closed with a quiet push. "That's fine," he said, standing, just loose from the wall. "I can send someone from the building to fix it." She nodded, but her shoulders didn't relax. "Thanks. I'll keep the window closed until then." He hesitated, then asked lightly, "You get much mail from the county?" Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Measuring him? Not much. "Usually notices about programs I don't qualify for." He thought about the envelope again, wondering if she knew exactly what it contained. The aid office didn't send letters for no reason. It could have been an approval, a voucher, or even a referral for emergency assistance. But it could also have been another rejection. Another reminder that she'd fallen just above the arbitrary line for help. Margaret reached for the kettle on the stove, filling it halfway before setting it on the burner. The motion was calm, but there was a distance in it, as though she'd closed a door between them without moving from the room. "Most of the time, it's not worth opening," she said, almost to herself. "They send the same words every time. Not eligible. Resources limited. Try again next quarter." Ruiz leaned back against the counter, studying her face. "And if it's not that?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Sometimes it's easier not to hope." The kettle began to hiss softly, steam curling. From the spout, she poured the water into the chipped mug, added a spoonful of instant coffee, and stirred without looking up. The subject was closed, at least for now. As he left the apartment a few minutes later, the image of that envelope stayed. With him, the crease in the corner, the unbroken seal, the way she'd pushed the drawer shut without thinking. It wasn't just unopened mail. It was a choice to avoid the possibility of disappointment, to hold off on facing whatever answer lay inside. Walking back to his cruiser, Ruiz realized that for someone like Margaret, survival meant managing more than bills and groceries. It meant controlling when and how hope was allowed into the room, and sometimes that meant leaving an envelope exactly where it was, untouched in a kitchen drawer. It was late in the afternoon when Ruiz finally asked her the question that had been circling in his mind since the night at the diner. They were sitting in the narrow kitchen, the late sunlight stretching through the thin curtain, casting faded shapes of flowers onto the floor. Margaret was peeling carrots over a small bowl, her movements slow and deliberate. He leaned against the counter, trying to sound casual, though the words felt heavier than he intended. "Why don't you take help when it's offered?" She didn't look up at first, the peels falling in soft curls into the bowl. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, "Because I've taken it before." He waited, sensing there was more, but not pushing. After a pause, she set the peeler down and rested her hands on the edge of the counter. "About a year after Daniel died, I went to the county office. I'd just started working at the diner, but the hours were short, and Ethan was sick that winter. I couldn't cover rent, I thought. Maybe there was something, a program, even just for a month to get us through." She told him how she'd filled out the forms, the way they made her list every detail of her life, income down to the cent, the children's names and ages, every debt, every bill. She remembered the waiting room chairs, the smell of burnt coffee, and the old clock ticking too loudly on the wall. Her number was finally called, and she stepped into a cubicle where a caseworker with tired eyes scanned her paperwork. She didn't say much at first, just typed. Then she asked why I hadn't tried harder to get more hours, why I hadn't thought to sell Daniel's tools, why I still had a TV in the apartment. Margaret's voice tightened slightly, but she kept going. It wasn't a flat screen, just an old secondhand thing I'd had for years. I told her the kids used it to watch movies. She said maybe they could go without for a while. Margaret shifted her weight, her gaze fixed somewhere past him, and then right there she called, and another worker to double-check the application. They stood over the desk talking about my life like I wasn't even there. One of them said it was hard to help people who didn't help themselves. And Ethan and Lily. They were sitting in the chairs by the wall. They heard every word. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. Ethan asked me later if we were in trouble. Lily didn't say anything, but she kept her head down for the rest of the day. We left without the paperwork finished. I told them I'd decided not to apply, but the truth is, they told me I didn't qualify. Too much income, they said. I was making $9 an hour at the time. She picked up the peeler again, resuming the slow scrape of the carrots. I walked out of that office feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. I promised myself, the kids wouldn't see me like that again. If that means doing without, we do without. If it means using napkins instead of buying paper towels, that's what we do. At least it's ours. Ruiz didn't interrupt. There wasn't much he could say that wouldn't sound like a lecture or pity, and she didn't need either. The sound of the peeler filled the silence, steady and rhythmic, like she was working the memory out of her system, one strip at a time. When she was done, she brushed the peels into the trash and rinsed the carrots under the tap. It's not that I think I'm above help, she added finally. It's that sometimes help comes with a price, and I can't afford that kind of cost, not when the kids are watching. Ruiz nodded slowly, understanding in a way he hadn't. Before, it wasn't pride for the sake of pride. It was protection for herself, for her children, for the last pieces of dignity she still controlled. And in that small kitchen, with the fading sunlight and the scent of fresh carrots in the air, he realized just how heavy that protection was to carry alone. It was a Tuesday evening when Ruiz first got a hint of it. He had stopped by the diner where Margaret worked to grab a quick coffee before heading back on patrol. She was behind the counter, refilling sugar dispensers, her hair pulled back in. A loose bun. Between customers, she slid a small brown paper bag across the counter to a woman in a faded green coat. No money changed hands. The woman nodded, murmured a thank you, and left without ordering anything. At first, Ruiz thought little of it, maybe just a favor for a friend. But later that night, as he drove through the neighborhood where Margaret lived, he saw the same woman from the diner step out of her building carrying the bag. A young boy trailed behind her, munching on what looked like a sandwich. The next time he saw Margaret, he mentioned it casually. She didn't deny it. In fact, she gave a small shrug, as if it wasn't worth making a big deal about. She's got 3 kids, Margaret said simply. Her youngest is in Ethan's class. Sometimes the school lunch doesn't stretch, and she works nights, so I give her what I can. As they talked, Ruiz realized it wasn't just that one family. Margaret knew nearly every parent in her building and a handful from Ethan and Lily's school. She kept track of who'd been short on rent, whose hours had been cut, which households were down to bread and margarine by the middle of the week. When she had extra whether it was from a pantry line, a bag of vegetables from the diner, or a sale at the discount store, she quietly passed it along. She told him about a neighbor. Upstairs, a single father who'd been laid off from the warehouse. He's proud, she said. Won't ask for help. So when I make soup, I take him a container and say, I made too much. That way, it's not charity, just sharing. Ruiz listened, noting how matter-of-fact she was about it, how there was no hint of self-congratulation. To her, it wasn't a mission or an organized effort. It was just survival, stretched to fit more than her own household. She didn't keep a ledger, didn't expect repayment. Sometimes, what she gave away was something she could have used herself, but she found ways to make do. He asked how she managed when she already had so little. She smiled faintly, almost like she was remembering something. When Daniel was alive, we had more. Not a lot, but enough that if someone needed a hand, we could give it. I guess I never learned how to stop doing that. It's harder now, but people still need. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that there was an unspoken network in their community. A web of quiet exchanges and favors. Someone with a working car gave rides to those without. Another person with a discount card at the grocery store picked up extra staples for a neighbor. It wasn't formal, and it certainly wasn't something the county aid office tracked, but it kept people afloat in ways official channels, COULDN. Single quotes. T. Ruiz thought about the unopened envelope in her kitchen drawer, about the humiliation she'd faced the last time she asked for help. In contrast, This was dignity preserved. No lines, no forms, no questions meant to measure worthiness. Just one person seeing another's need and answering it in the small ways they could. Margaret admitted that sometimes the giving came back around. A neighbor might watch her kids for an hour when her shift ran late. Someone else might slip a pack of napkins into her tote, knowing she used them for everything. "It's not charity," she said again, as if that word was something she kept. At a distance, it's just people helping each other stay standing. As Ruiz walked back to his cruiser that night, he caught himself thinking that in all the training he'd had on community policing, no one had ever explained this. The undercurrent of survival that didn't make it into reports or data sheets. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw unless you were close enough to notice the small exchanges, the quiet nods, the bags of food passed across counters without a word. Margaret lived in scarcity, but she refused to live in isolation, and that, he realized, might be the only reason some of the people around her were still managing to hold on. Ruiz spent the next few days turning the problem over in his head. He knew Margaret would never accept direct charity, not after hearing what happened at the county office. Anything that resembled a handout would make her shut down. But doing nothing didn't sit right with him either. He'd seen her cupboards, he'd heard the way Lily talked about good napkins as if they were a rare treat, and he'd watched her quietly divide what little she had between herself, her children, and neighbors in need. He started small. One evening, he called his cousin Alina, who ran a small bakery in town. She often had unsold bread and pastries at the end of the day. Normally, she donated them to the shelter, but he asked if she could set aside a bag for him once or twice a week. He didn't explain the full story, just that he had a family in mind who could use it. Alina didn't ask questions. The next step was talking to his old friend Marco, a mechanic who owed him a favor. Marco sometimes bought bulk paper goods for his shop, towels, tissues, even napkins, and could spare a few packs without missing them. Ruiz made it clear he didn't want anything fancy, nothing that would make it obvious they were gifts. It has to look like something that just happened to come their way, he told him. He also reached out to the pastor at the church where he'd seen Margaret in the pantry line. The pastor was used to navigating the pride of those who came for help. Together, they came up with an idea. Occasionally, miscount items in pantry boxes, leaving extra in a bag and sending it with her by accident. If she thought she was taking something meant for her, not special treatment, she'd be less likely to refuse. Ruiz kept all of this quiet. He didn't want it to feel orchestrated, and he didn't want Margaret to feel surrounded by people waiting to see how she'd react. The idea was to weave the help into the edges of her life so it didn't stand out. A few extra rolls of paper towels in a neighbor's grocery bag, a carton of eggs slipped into the diner's to-go order for her after a late shift, bags of bread from Melina left on her doorstep in the early morning before she and the kids were awake. The challenge was making sure none of it carried the scent of pity. He'd learned quickly that pity had a sharp smell. It clung to tone, to body language, to the smallest choice of words. People like Margaret, who had been burned before, could detect it instantly. So he treated the exchanges as though they were routine. If he handed her something, it was always with a reason that didn't make her the center of a favor. Alina made too much again. Marco bought the wrong kind of napkins for the shop. The pastor asked if you could hold onto these until he finds someone who needs them. Involving others had another effect Ruiz hadn't entirely expected. Word spread quietly through the network of people he trusted, and soon others began contributing without being asked. A retired teacher from the church dropped off a bag of school supplies for Ethan and Lily. One of the diner's regulars, overhearing Alina mention her surplus bread, offered to throw in fresh fruit from his garden. Nobody confronted Margaret directly. They just made sure things appeared where they would be useful. Ruiz kept his role small and invisible. He wasn't trying to take credit or become her rescuer. It was about making sure she and the kids had a little more breathing room without taking away the control she fought so hard to keep each time he saw her. He could tell she didn't suspect how coordinated it really was. She just seemed to think her luck had shifted slightly, that life had decided to be a little kinder for a while. For Ruiz, that was enough. He didn't need her to know the full story. What mattered was that she wasn't facing every shortage alone, and that whatever help she received came without strings, without humiliation, and without the look he'd seen on her face the night at the diner when she hesitated to answer his question. This way, the dignity stayed intact, and the help kept coming. The first time it happened, Margaret thought someone had made a mistake. It was early morning, still dim outside, when she opened her apartment door to grab the newspaper Lily brought in for a school project. Right beside the doorframe sat a plain brown grocery bag, folded neatly at the top. She glanced down the hallway, empty, no footsteps, no sound of retreating shoes on the stairs. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, a carton of eggs, a bag of apples, and a package of napkins still in its wrapper. Everything was fresh, nothing dented or past date. She stood there for a moment, the bag cradled in her arms, debating whether to carry it inside or set it back out, in case someone came looking for it. In the end, the apples decided it for her. Ethan loved apples, and it had been weeks since she'd been able to afford more than a few. She checked with her closest neighbors, asking if anyone had left groceries by mistake. All of them shook their heads. Most were in the same position she was, counting coins before heading to the store hoping for sales. A couple of them eyed the bag's contents with curiosity, but no one claimed it. A week later, another bag appeared. This time it was in the late afternoon, after she returned from her shift at the diner. It had been tucked just far enough to the side that she might have missed it. If not for the sunlight catching the corner of a cereal box poking out, she carried it in, more curious now than before. Inside were pantry staples, pasta, canned, tomatoes, peanut butter, and a smaller bag of oranges resting on top. Margaret mentioned it casually to the kids that night over dinner. Lily's eyes widened, and Ethan asked if it was like the time Mrs. Dorsey left cookies on their doorstep. For Christmas. Maybe, Margaret said, though she doubted it. Mrs. Dorsey always rang the bell, wanting to chat. Whoever was doing this seemed intent on staying invisible. The deliveries weren't regular enough to predict. Sometimes 2 weeks passed without a sign, other times a bag would appear only days after the last one. The contents varied, but there was always something in it that Margaret had been quietly wishing she could afford milk when they'd run out early. Paper towels when her last roll had been cut into smaller sheets to stretch its use. A pack of sandwich bags she hadn't bought in months. She tried watching for the delivery, peeking through the peephole at odd hours, or leaving her door unlocked so she could hear the hallway traffic better. But whoever was doing it was careful. She never caught so much as a shadow slipping past. One afternoon, she thought she might have been close. She came home early from her shift and found the bag already there, still faintly cool to the touch, as if it had only been set down minutes earlier. She stepped into the hallway and looked both ways. An elderly man from the 3rd floor was heading toward the stairs, but he didn't so much as glance back at her. At first, the mystery left her unsettled. She didn't like owing anyone, especially when she didn't know who they were or why. They were choosing her. But as the weeks went on, she found herself easing into the rhythm of it. She stopped interrogating her neighbors and let the groceries be what they were, a strange kind of luck she couldn't explain. Still, there were moments late at night as she put the last of the dishes away when she'd glance at the bag, folded neatly in the corner for reuse, and wonder. Was it someone from the building? A church volunteer? An old friend of Daniel's? She never mentioned it to anyone outside the kids, afraid that drawing attention to it might make it stop. The anonymity of it made the help easier to accept. There was no face to thank, no voice offering reassurances that made her feel smaller. Just quiet, practical kindness, arriving without ceremony and leaving without a trace. And though she didn't know it, that was exactly how Ruiz intended it to be. It started with a substitute teacher in Lily's 5th grade class, a woman named Mrs. Keating who had spent decades teaching before retiring. She noticed small things that others overlooked, how Lily always unwrapped her sandwich from a folded paper napkin instead of plastic wrap or a lunchbox. How Ethan, in the 2nd grade, ate with the same kind of napkin under his sandwich, like a plate. On the surface, it was harmless, even resourceful. But there was a detail Mrs. Keating couldn't shake. The napkins were the kind given out in diners, with a faint patterned edge and a softness that came only from handling, not from a store. Packaged out one afternoon, during indoor recess, Mrs. Keating struck up a conversation with Lily while she was cleaning up her desk. She asked in the light, casual tone that children respond to, "Who makes your lunch, honey?" Lily's face lit up. "Mom does. She's really good at it, and sometimes we get the good napkins." Mrs. Keating smiled, but asked what made them good. Lily explained without hesitation, that they were softer than the rough kind from school, and that they didn't fall apart when the sandwich was heavy. She added, as if it were the most natural thing. Mom gets them from places we go after work. She keeps them so we can use them instead of buying those bags at the store. The answer landed heavily. Mrs. Keating had taught enough children over the years to know what it meant when families found creative ways to replace something small but necessary. She didn't press further, but that night she wrote down what she'd learned. The next day, she quietly approached Ethan's teacher to ask if she had noticed anything similar. The answer came quickly. Yes, and she'd also noticed Ethan offering half his sandwich to another boy whose lunch was often light. Mrs. Keating decided to take a step. She spoke to the principal in private, careful to frame it in a way that respected Margaret's dignity. She didn't want to trigger a mandatory report that might involve social services unnecessarily. She wanted to help without making the family feel exposed. The principal agreed to let her handle it quietly. She began by reaching out to a few trusted staff members and parents she had known for years. People she was certain would understand the importance of discretion. She told them only what they needed to know, that a family in the school community could use some quiet support, and that the best way to help was through something untraceable to the children. They decided on a small fundraiser, not a public campaign with posters and announcements, but a word-of-mouth effort among a circle of people they trusted. Mrs. Keating kept a plain envelope in the staff lounge, labeled only with a sticky note that read, "Lunches." A handful of teachers and aides began slipping in small bills. A parent volunteer added grocery store gift cards, tucked between folded notes, within 2 weeks. The envelope held enough to cover months of packed lunches, if spent carefully. Mrs. Keating purchased reusable containers and sandwich wraps that could pass as ordinary gifts, then used the rest for groceries she delivered to the school kitchen. The kitchen manager, in on the plan, began sending Lily and Ethan home with extra portions from cooking classes or school events, always framed as leftovers that would go to waste otherwise. The children never suspected the shift in their lunches was anything but luck. Lily told her mother she thought the school must be getting fancier napkins in the cafeteria because sometimes one ended up in her lunch bag. Ethan boasted about the cool containers he now had for his sandwiches, saying they kept the bread from squishing. Margaret noticed the changes but couldn't quite piece them together. The extra groceries she'd been finding at her door already felt like a puzzle, and now the lunches seemed easier to prepare without stretching her supplies thin. She didn't know about the envelope in the staff lounge or how a retired teacher had quietly organized an entire chain of generosity without ever attaching her name to it. For Mrs. Keating, that was the point. The help was never meant to be traced back, never meant to carry the weight of charity. It was just a way to make sure 2 children didn't have to rely on diner napkins to hold their lunches together, and to give their mother one less corner to cut. The monthly town meeting was usually a sleepy affair, held in the echoing chamber of the municipal building with the same dozen residents who came every time. Most people attended only when there was a contentious zoning proposal or a debate about taxes. That night, the room was half full, with the hum of small talk filling the air as the council worked through the early items on the agenda. Road repairs, a library budget adjustment, a request for a new stop sign. Officer Daniel Ruiz sat in the back, uniform neat, hands folded, listening without much engagement. He hadn't planned on speaking at all. It was during the open comment period that he felt the urge to stand. The mayor, a gray-haired man who liked order and predictability, nodded toward him in mild surprise. "Officer Ruiz," he said, "you have the floor." Ruiz walked to the microphone at the center aisle, his boots making a measured sound against the tile. He rested his hands on the podium, scanning the room. "I want to talk about something that doesn't show up on our reports," he began, his voice steady. "Something we don't see unless we're looking for it, and sometimes not even then." The room quieted a little, people leaning in. "We have families in this town who are doing everything right, and it's still not enough. They're working, paying rent, keeping their kids in school, but behind their doors, they're cutting corners. Most of us don't think about reusing paper napkins, skipping meals so their kids can eat, patching clothes instead of buying new ones." He didn't name Margaret, didn't need to. Instead, He spoke in generalities that carried the weight of lived observation. He told them about apartments with cupboards that held more air than food, about parents who worked 3 jobs but still couldn't cover basic expenses because wages had stayed the same while costs climbed. He described lunches wrapped in whatever could be found, children who spoke about good napkins as if they were a small luxury. I'm not here asking for a new program or a budget line. Ruiz continued, I'm asking for awareness. Poverty here doesn't always look like what you think it does. It's not just the homeless person sleeping in the park or someone holding a cardboard sign. Sometimes it's the neighbor you wave to every morning, whose car always seems to be running fine, whose kids show up to school on time. You might never guess what's going on when their door is closed. A woman from the audience raised her hand to ask what could be done if people wanted to help. Ruiz paused, considering how much to say. If you know someone who's struggling, don't make a show of it. Don't ask them to stand up and tell their story. Just find a way to make their life a little easier without making them feel smaller. That might mean leaving a bag of groceries at their door and walking away. It might mean paying for something quietly. Sometimes the best help is the kind that doesn't come with strings or questions. The room stayed quiet after he spoke. A few council members shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable perhaps, with how close the examples felt to people they knew. The mayor thanked him and moved to the next item, but the mood had changed. The conversations during the break were softer. More thoughtful, Ruiz returned to his seat in the back, hands folded again. He hadn't named her, and no one in that room could point to a single person with certainty. But he knew some would leave thinking about the people on their own streets, and maybe, in some small way, they'd start looking differently at the closed doors around them. That was all he wanted. The day after the town meeting, Ruiz stopped by the diner for his usual coffee before starting his shift. He didn't notice the man at the counter right away, a reporter from the county paper who often covered council meetings. The reporter was nursing a cup of black coffee and scrolling through notes on his phone, glancing up only when Ruiz walked in. Nice speech last night, he said, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. Got people talking. Ruiz nodded, not offering. He didn't want to feed the conversation, but the reporter was already leaning forward. You were talking about someone specific, weren't you? Someone here in town? Ruiz took a sip of coffee, buying time. I was talking about a problem, he said evenly, not a person. The reporter smiled faintly, as though they were playing a game he expected to win. Still, it's the kind of story people would want to read. Quiet struggle, small-town resilience. I could keep it anonymous if I had to. Ruiz shook his head. It's not my story to tell. But by the time he left the diner, he had a sinking feeling. Word traveled fast in a small town, and all it would take was a little digging for someone to find Margaret's name. He knew she valued her privacy fiercely, and the last thing she would want was her life laid out in print for strangers to read. That afternoon, the worry proved justified. Margaret was outside her building, shaking crumbs from a dish towel over the railing when the reporter pulled up in his sedan. He stepped out, notebook in hand, and introduced himself. He was polite, even warm, saying he'd been moved by what had come up at the meeting and wanted to highlight the reality of working families who were quietly holding communities together. Margaret stiffened almost immediately. I don't want my name in the paper, she said before he'd even asked. The reporter tried again, promising anonymity, saying her experience could help others understand what poverty looked like when it wasn't obvious. Shaking her head, you think you can write it without my name, she said, but people here will know. They always know. Then they start looking at you different, like you're a case file instead of a person. The reporter's expression softened, but he kept pressing. It might bring help. Donations, maybe. A church group. Could she cut him off, sharply? I'm not a headline. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was finality in it. She didn't owe her pain to strangers, didn't want her children to walk into school and hear whispers because their mother's struggles had been printed for everyone's breakfast table. The conversation ended quickly after that. The reporter tucked his notebook away, muttered that he understood, and got back in his car. But the exchange left Margaret tense, her hands tight around the dish towel long after he drove off. Later that evening, Ruiz stopped by to check in. She told him about the reporter. Her words clipped. I don't need pity wrapped up as a story, she said. Ruiz didn't argue. He knew her boundaries weren't about pride alone. They were about control, about keeping some part of her life untouched by outside judgment. In the weeks that followed, Margaret kept an eye out for the newspaper, scanning each issue to make sure her name wasn't there. The reporter never did publish anything specific, though she noticed a short piece about hidden poverty in small towns. It was vague, missing the personal details that would have made it compelling, and that was exactly how she wanted it. For Margaret, avoiding that spotlight wasn't just relief. It was a reminder that she could still choose what parts of her story the world got to see, and what parts would stay hers alone. Ruiz found her on the narrow walkway outside her apartment, sitting on the low step with a laundry basket at her feet. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Margaret was folding clothes methodically, smoothing each shirt before stacking it, her movements calm, but with an edge that suggested her thoughts were elsewhere. Ruiz stood for a moment before speaking, not wanting to startle her. "Got a minute?" he asked. She looked up, wary but not unkind, and gestured for him to sit on the step beside her. "I've been talking to some folks," he began, keeping his voice low. After the meeting, people reached out. They want to help. Nothing flashy, nothing that would put you on display, just help. Margaret let out a small breath. Help always comes with a price. "Officer Ruiz, it doesn't have to," he said. "They could drop things off quietly. No names, no fuss." She shook her head, eyes fixed on the shirt in her hands. "You don't understand. It's not about me. It's about Lily and Ethan. Kids notice everything, and they repeat it. If word gets around that we're getting charity, they'll hear about it before lunch, and it won't be kind." Ruiz thought about the way children could be blunt, sometimes cruel, without realizing the depth of their words. "Think they'd be teased?" "I know they would," she said firmly. "When Ethan was in first grade, I missed the deadline to pay for the field trip. He stayed behind with a few others, and someone told him his mom was too broke. He came home quiet that day, wouldn't talk until bedtime. I could see it in his face. That kind of shame sticks. I'm not putting them through that again." She folded another shirt, slower this time, pressing the fabric like she could iron out the memory. "Lily's old enough now to understand more than I want her to. She already notices when I'm cutting corners, when dinner is smaller, when I'm saving the last of something for them instead of eating it myself. If she thinks we're being pitied, she'll start worrying about me. I want them to be kids, not caretakers." Ruiz leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Margaret, no one's trying to pity you. They respect you. They see you holding things together, when most people would have collapsed under half the—" "Wait," she met his gaze then, her expression steady but guarded. "Respect doesn't stop gossip. It doesn't stop whispers at the grocery store when someone notices you're paying with assistance. People say they understand, but they still treat you different. And once that happens, you can't take it back." The silence between them was long filled with the soft rustle of fabric as she kept folding. Ruiz wanted to argue, to tell her that not everyone would see it that way, but he couldn't deny she had a point. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, privacy was a fragile thing. Finally, he said, "So what would you accept? If the help came in a way no one could trace?" Margaret hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe, if the kids never knew it wasn't me who made it happen. If they could think I managed it on my own." Ruiz nodded slowly. That was something he could work with. But he also understood that any step toward helping her would have to be taken carefully, like moving across thin ice, quiet, deliberate, and without drawing attention. As he stood to leave, Margaret added softly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, I just need to protect them first." From everything, Ruiz walked away with her words lingering in his mind, aware that her resistance wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was armor built from years of small wounds no one else had seen. The wind had been rattling the windows since before dawn, but by late afternoon, the sky had deepened to a heavy gray that promised more than just flurries. The storm rolled in without pause, sharp gusts tearing through the alley between buildings, carrying snow in sideways sheets. Inside Margaret's apartment, the lights flickered twice, then went dark. The hum of the old refrigerator stopped, and the faint warmth from the baseboard heaters began to fade almost immediately. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the sudden stillness. Lily was at the table working on a drawing, her pencil frozen midline, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, building a shaky tower of mismatched blocks. Both looked up at her, waiting for some reassurance she didn't quite have. "It's just the storm," she said, forcing her voice into something light. "We'll make it cozy." She moved quickly, pulling the old quilt from the couch and draping it over both children. They huddled together without protest. Margaret's own hands were already cold, and she knew from experience how quickly the chill would seep into the apartment. The windows were thin, the kind that let drafts in even on mild days. She shut the curtains, pushed rolled towels against the gaps at the bottom of the doors, and lit the stub of a candle on the counter. It gave off more shadow than light, but it was something. When she felt the cold creeping through the floor, she thought of the shoes by the door. The kids' sneakers were thin, not made for weather like this. She opened the cupboard above the sink, where she kept the small, uneven stacks of napkins she'd collected from diners and takeout counters over the past months. Most were plain white, a few stamped with fading logos from places they'd never eaten in. She carried them to the table, the kids watching curiously. "What are those for?" Ethan asked. She knelt beside him. "It's a trick I learned from my dad when I was little," she said. "If your feet are warm, the rest of you stays warmer. We're going to make shoe liners." She layered the napkins carefully, folding them to fit inside the sneakers. The paper crackled under her fingers, softening as it bent. She slipped the makeshift liners into the shoes, then helped each child pull them on. The napkins formed a thin cushion, adding a layer against the icy floor. Lily wiggled her toes experimentally. "It feels weird," she said, but she didn't complain. Ethan grinned like it was a game. "Secret armor," he declared, stomping his feet for effect. Margaret smiled at their reactions, though her own shoes stayed empty of anything extra. She could keep moving to stay warm. The kids couldn't. She poured the last of the hot water from the thermos into 2 mugs and added a spoonful of cocoa mix to each, stirring until the scent filled the small room. It wasn't much, but the heat from the mugs gave their hands something to hold on to. As darkness thickened outside, the storm pressed harder against the building. The candle's flame shivered with each draft that slipped through. Margaret wrapped herself in her coat and sat with the children under the quilt, telling them an old story about camping in the mountains, about pretending to be explorers weathering a snowstorm. Ethan leaned against her side. Lily's head rested on her shoulder, their breaths warm against her. The apartment was cold enough now that her own feet had gone numb, but she didn't move. The napkins in their shoes would hold for a while, and that was enough. When the power finally returned hours later, the hum of the heater felt almost startling, but she kept them tucked close until the air warmed again. For the rest of that winter, the stack of napkins in the cupboard became more than just something to wrap lunches. They were insulation, padding, and, in moments like this, the smallest kind of shield against the cold. The call from Lily came in a whisper from the bedroom. Margaret was in the kitchen rinsing a saucepan when she heard her daughter's voice, thin and urgent. "Mom, Ethan's not okay." She dropped the pan into the sink and hurried down the short hallway. Ethan was curled on his side, flushed and shivering, his small hands clutching his stomach. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, and when she touched his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin made her stomach clench. They'd had colds before, fevers too, but this felt different, sharper. Margaret tried the thermometer. The numbers blinked back higher than she wanted to see. She made the decision in seconds. "Get your coat, Lily. We're going." She wrapped Ethan in the thickest blanket they had, pulling her own coat over her pajamas, not stopping to find shoes that matched. The wind outside cut through her clothes as they made their way to the bus stop. The last bus for the night came slow through the snow, its headlights haloed in the flurries. Inside, the air smelled faintly of diesel and wet wool. Ethan's head rested against her shoulder, his weight heavy and limp. Lily sat closed eyes wide, clutching the bag Margaret had hastily packed a bottle of water, a few crackers, and the bundle of napkins she always kept folded in her tote. By the time they reached the emergency room, the waiting area was full. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the linoleum, too bright for the late hour. Margaret approached the desk, gave her son's name, explained the fever, the stomach pain, the difficulty breathing. The nurse nodded, professional but distant, and handed her a clipboard. "Have a seat. We'll call you as soon as we can." They found 3 chairs wedged between a man dozing in a winter coat and a young mother rocking a crying baby. Ethan coughed, a dry scraping sound, and pressed his face into her sleeve. She reached into the tote and pulled out one of the napkins, folding it in half before pressing it into his hand. He wiped his nose without looking, then leaned into her again. 1 napkin became 2, then more. She tried to keep them neat, folding each used one carefully before tucking it into a small plastic bag. The stack she'd brought, the ones collected over months from diners, cafes, and takeout counters, was meant for lunches, for wrapping sandwiches and apples. But now, in the too bright Tuckled they were serving another purpose. Hours passed in a blur of beeping monitors, murmured conversations, and the sound of people shifting in uncomfortable chairs. Margaret rubbed Ethan's back in small circles. Watching the clock creep forward, Lily dozed with her head in her mother's lap, her legs pulled tight beneath her. Margaret adjusted the blanket around both children, ignoring the ache in her own shoulders. She noticed a man across the room, watching her, his eyes settling on the pile of napkins in her lap. There was no malice in his gaze, only a kind of quiet understanding. And she looked away quickly, embarrassed by how clearly her life could be read in that small stack of paper. When their names were finally called, it was close to dawn. Ethan was led into an exam room, his blanket still wrapped around him, clutching the last clean napkin in his fist. The doctor listened, examined, and explained that it was a severe flu, the kind that could turn dangerous if not treated promptly. They'd keep him for a few hours, watch him closely, give him fluids. Margaret sat beside the bed, the napkin now damp in Ethan's small hand, and thought about how much she had relied on them in the past year. Something so disposable, taken for granted by most, had become one of the most constant tools in her life, in the kitchen, in the cold, and now in a hospital at the edge of morning. The conversation began without planning. Ruiz had stopped by late in the afternoon, his uniform jacket unzipped, hat in his hand as if to signal this wasn't official business. Margaret opened the door halfway, expecting maybe a question about the storm last week or some follow-up from the town meeting. Instead, he just asked if he could come in for a minute. The apartment was warmer than the last time he'd visited, but the signs of scarcity were the same. The cupboard doors slightly ajar, revealing half-empty shelves, the quilt draped over the couch with frayed edges, the shoes by the door lined with flattened napkins. She gestured for him to sit at the table, then poured 2 mugs of tea from the last of a box she'd been stretching out for weeks. For a while, they talked about other things, the weather turning his rounds, how Lily's drawing from school had won a little ribbon. Ruiz didn't rush it. He asked in the same calm tone he used for everything, and eventually, after a pause that lingered just a little too long, he shifted in his chair and said, "Margaret, I need to ask you something." About that night at the diner, she stilled, her fingers tightening around the mug. "It was just napkins," she said quietly, almost reflexively. "I know," he replied. "I'm not here to write you up. I can't stop wondering why." "I don't think it's because you needed extras for the kitchen." Her gaze stayed on the tea, steam curling into the space between them. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was steady but stripped of anything that might soften the truth. "Because I can't afford the things they replace." She told him how the grocery store trip came after rent, utilities, and bus fare, and how that left little for anything beyond the cheapest staples. Paper goods, tissues, paper towels, they didn't make the list anymore. She'd learned to stretch everything. Cloth rags washed until they fell apart, napkins from diners saved in a drawer. They worked as lunch wraps, hand wipes, even insulation. In shoes during storms, it sounds small, she said, but it's not small when you don't have it. Kids spill, they catch colds, they need clean hands before they eat. I can't send them to school with nothing, so I give them what I can, folded up in their lunchbox so they can wipe their nose or keep a sandwich from falling apart. I'd rather do that than have them be the ones with sticky fingers and no way to fix it, the ones other kids talk about. Her words carried no self-pity, only a kind of blunt logic. She explained how, after Daniel died, the debts had eaten through what little safety net they'd had. She'd kept the lights on and the rent paid, but everything else came down to choices most people never had to make. Ruiz listened without interrupting, his tea growing cold in front of him. She spoke of the times she'd tried to accept help, The food pantry line where someone ahead of her whispered about freeloaders. The county office where a worker's tone shifted when she saw Margaret's address, the glance her children noticed and remembered. "I'd rather find my own way," she said, "even if that way is paper napkins stuffed into a tote bag." When she finished, there was no tidy conclusion, no reassurance that things would get better soon. Just the truth sitting between them, the same as it had been before she spoke it aloud. Ruiz nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, and she realized he'd suspected most of it already. What he hadn't known, what he couldn't have known, was how something so ordinary could become a quiet shield. One folded square at a time, between her children and a world that noticed too much when people had too little. It started without announcements, without anyone saying they were doing anything at all. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when Margaret opened her front door to find a cardboard box resting on the mat. Inside were paper towels, tissues, toilet paper, the kinds of things that had been rationed in her home for years. There was no note, no name, just a small strip of masking tape holding the box shut. She brought it inside, setting it on the table like something fragile the next day. Lily came home from school with her lunchbox, heavier than usual. Inside, alongside her usual sandwich, there was an apple wrapped in a napkin and a note from the cafeteria worker, extra for later. It was folded small, not meant to draw attention, but the care was obvious. Ethan had a similar surprise, a granola bar tucked into his backpack with a smiley face drawn on the wrapper at the diner, where the whole thing had quietly begun. The owner began slipping sealed packages of napkins into Margaret's takeout orders without charging for them. Sometimes it was a sleeve of them hidden beneath the sandwiches. Sometimes it was a discreet handoff as she paid at the counter. He didn't mention it, and neither did she. But the exchange carried its own understanding. Within a week, the ripple had spread. A neighbor from down the hall knocked one evening, holding a grocery bag of cleaning supplies and pasta. "I bought too much," she said simply, setting it on the counter before Margaret could protest. Another neighbor left a bag of apples and oranges outside her door. When Margaret tried to return them, the woman just shook her head and walked away. The school secretary, a woman Margaret had only spoken to in passing, called to say that Lily and Ethan had been signed up for the weekend snack pack program. It was normally for families who requested it, but the packs began arriving in the kids' backpacks on Fridays discreetly, sealed in brown paper so no one else would see. Inside were crackers, fruit cups, juice boxes, and small packs of tissues. Even the church pantry, where Margaret had always taken less than her share, seemed to notice. On her next visit, the volunteer at the table quietly slipped extra paper products into her bag and moved on to the next person. No one asked her to stand in front of a group to receive anything. No one made a show of telling her they understood. These gestures came in the form of small, useful things. The items she had gone without for so long that their sudden abundance felt strange. The cupboards that had once been half empty now had rolls of paper towels stacked neatly on the lower shelf. The drawer where she kept her napkin stash now held an entire unopened package of tissues, still in its plastic wrap. One evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. In front of her were the boxes and bags that had arrived over the past 2 weeks. None of them had brand new tags or the kind of unnecessary extras that sometimes came with charity drives. They were practical, chosen by people who seemed to understand exactly what she needed. She didn't know who had started it, whether it was Ruiz quietly telling the right people or the diner owner deciding not to keep the story to himself. But the effect was the same, a community shifting around her, filling the gaps she had been patching alone. And they were doing it without requiring her to explain, without turning her life into a public story for the first time in years. She folded a napkin for Ethan's lunch and knew she could replace it tomorrow without worry. It was a small thing, but it changed the way the whole day felt. The clink of coffee cups and the low murmur of conversation filled the diner as the morning rush tapered off. Margaret moved between tables with a practiced rhythm, a pot of fresh coffee in one hand and a stack of menus in the other. The smell of bacon and toast lingered in the air, the kind of scent that settled into your clothes and stayed with you all day. She didn't mind. The job had been hers for only a month, but already she knew the regulars, the way they liked their eggs. Which ones lingered over the newspaper, and which grabbed their meal to go. She wore the apron the owner had given her on her first day, pockets deep enough to hold an order pad, a pen, and tucked neatly in the corner, a small bundle of folded paper napkins. It had become habit, though not for the same reason as before. Now they were there because she found them useful at work, wiping down tables between customers, handing one to a child who had spilled juice, wrapping a muffin for the man who always stopped by before his shift at the hardware store. There was no edge of shame in the act anymore. The napkins were part of her job, as ordinary as the coffee filters stacked by the machine or the rolls of silverware she wrapped before the lunch crowd arrived. But every time she slipped a fresh stack into her pocket, she felt the faint echo of another time, the quiet, deliberate way she used to fold them into her tote bag. When she thought no one was watching, the owner had been the one to offer her the job. It happened after the quiet generosity had begun. The boxers on her doorstep, the stocked cupboard, the lunch packs tucked into her children's bags. One morning, he'd walked her to the counter after she'd come in for a takeout sandwich and asked, almost casually, if she wanted a few shifts a week. "You're here often enough," he'd joked. "Might as well be on the clock." She'd said yes, though the idea of being on the other side of the counter had felt strange at first. Now, the diner had become a kind of second home. Lily and Ethan sometimes came in after school, sliding into a booth with their homework while she finished her shift. The regulars knew their names, and the cook always made sure they left with something extra. Margaret still worked other jobs, but this one carried something different. Stability mixed with familiarity, the feeling of being somewhere she belonged. The apartment looked different too. The drawer that had once held her good napkins was now filled with clean dish towels and store-bought paper products. The cupboards were no longer bare, though she still organized them carefully, mindful of how quickly supplies could vanish if she stopped paying attention. Some habits, she'd learned, never left entirely, they just shifted into new shapes. On her break, she sometimes sat in the back room sipping coffee from a chipped mug and folding napkins into triangles. She liked the quiet repetition, the way the thin paper yielded under her fingers. Other waitresses laughed about how many she kept on hand, teasing that she was preparing for a spill that hadn't happened yet. She smiled at their comments but never explained outside. The town moved at its usual pace, school buses rumbling down the street, delivery trucks backing into the alley. Margaret knew that most people passing by the diner wouldn't think twice about the small woman moving between tables, coffee pot in hand. They wouldn't know the story of the napkins or what they had once meant, and she was fine with that. When the shift ended, she wiped down her last table, gathered her tips, and slipped the folded napkins from her pocket into her bag. Not because she needed them for home, that time had passed, but because she liked having them close, a reminder not of scarcity, but of the resourcefulness that had carried her through it.